This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Early in the native forest succession process, flammable species like manuka, kanuka and gorse dominate. A nature-friendly solution to help protect our buildings from the possibility of fire is to plant a green firebreak. So what is it? And what species should we plant? How wide should a green firebreak be? Where should it go? And how should we look after it? Listen in to find out. Kia ora, welcome to Rewilding in Action with me, your host, Maureen Howard. Now, in the last episode, I visited with Hendrik Koch on the site of the property Volco, where the trustees are allowing natural native forest regeneration to happen through gorse. Now, Hendrik pointed out that to reduce the risk of fire, they've planted natives near the dwellings there. So in this episode, we're going to find out more about why they've done this. And with climate change, we're seeing increased temperatures, droughts and wind events, ingredients that all make a fire burn harder. And sun-tolerant species like gorse, kanuka and manuka are highly flammable, so it's really important to think about fire risk and how to minimise it and contain it. Now, one biodiversity-friendly solution is a green firebreak. So for this episode, I'm here in the OAR FM studio to chat via Zoom with plant ecologist, Associate Professor Dr. Tim Curran from Lincoln University. And one of Tim's specialisations is how plants respond to extreme disturbance events, including fire. So thank you very much, Tim, for coming on the programme.
Kia ora, very welcome to be here. Thanks for having me, Maureen.
It's great. I'm very excited to have you here because I've been wanting to do an episode on this topic for quite some time. It's something that everyone who's doing natural native forest regeneration really needs to be considering. Because, of course, in most situations, we're going to be having dwellings probably fairly close to the areas that we're rewilding. So I really want to jump straight in. And we've been told that fire breaks are an important tool to stop or slow fire. So tell me what a green firebreak is.
Yeah, sure. So a green firebreak is a strip of low flammability vegetation established at strategic points across the landscape to slow down a fire, in some cases actually stop that fire. And they do that by catching embers, so firebrands that are blown ahead of the fire front. They can also block radiant heat and they can reduce the impact of flames on anything behind them. So these have been established in a wide range of countries throughout the world. In fact, they're known from every vegetated continent, so everywhere except Antarctica. And they actually have quite a long history. There's evidence going back to the Song dynasty in China, for instance, around 900 AD of plants with known low flammability being planted next to houses to reduce fire impacts. And if we go across the ditch to Australia, there's also a long, rich Aboriginal oral history of understanding the flammability of different vegetation types and knowing which vegetation types to go and shelter in during fire seasons. So they've been widely deployed throughout the world, including here in New Zealand. And it's, as you mentioned, just one of many different fire mitigation measures that landowners could perhaps use to help protect their houses from fire.
And it's one, I think, that will appeal to our listeners because many of us were really passionate about biodiversity and we're wanting to get more of those native trees in. And I can really see a good place perhaps for some planting that might even be an additional seed source for regeneration.
Oh, very much so. And we're actually quite lucky here in New Zealand in that a lot of our native bush species, our native forest species, are essentially rainforest species. So a lot of those species, not all of them, but a lot of those species actually have quite low flammability. And if we're aiming to restore forest in New Zealand, we're generally restoring back to the rainforest that was here previously. And by and large, that's going to be lower in flammability than most other vegetation that we currently have around the place.
And if people are listening overseas, of course, these are temperate rainforests, aren't they? We're not quite in the tropics yet.
That's very true. That's yeah. Although there's a few subtropical elements to some of our rainforest species, and certainly up around Northland there's what might be called warm temperate rainforests, but it's very much temperate rainforest at a global scale.
So we'll go a little bit deeper into if someone's wanting to plant a green firebreak, how wide does it need to be? What kind of dimensions are we looking at?
Yeah, so that's really the $1,000,000 question with green firebreaks, Maureen, and it's a difficult one to answer for the main reason that there's not been huge amounts of testing worldwide on what is the best width to use for a green firebreak. There's some testing in China, and China's actually the world leader with green firebreaks. They've by now established 500 million kilometres of green firebreaks throughout the country. They've been sort of doing that since the 1980s when they had some very serious forest fires, and they decided that green firebreaks would be one of the main tools that they'd use to mitigate future wildfires. So some of the work that comes out there shows that even a 10-metre wide green firebreak planted on top of a ridge has been able to stop a wildfire that actually reached 15-metre flame height, so quite high flame heights, and an estimated fire line intensity of about 35,000 kilowatts per metre. And that's about the same intensity as the upper limit of the 2017 Port Hills fires. So there is some suggestion that, green firebreaks, even fairly narrow ones, might actually do some good under certain circumstances. There's a wide range of different guidelines, anywhere between 10 and 30 metres. Some suggestions relative to the height of the surrounding forest. So they suggest it should be 1.5 times the average height of the forest around there. Others quite rightly point out that green firebreaks might need to be wider if they're on a slope, because fires travel much more quickly and more intensely uphill, because with the heat going up, and the flames sort of also going up, it's more likely that the fire will contact fuel and preheat and contact fuel more easily going up a slope. So there's essentially at the moment we've got a range of rules of thumb as to how wide they should be. There's a whole host of different things that you need to be thinking about when defending against a wildfire, which is why we sort of recommend that you actually use a wide range of different measures. You don't just use green firebreaks, you use them in combination with a range of other things as well too. But certainly green firebreaks, for the reasons you sort of mentioned at the start, are really appealing because they've got a wide range of other benefits as well too. They provide, if you're planting native species, they provide habitat for wildlife. A number of our low flammability trees and shrubs here in New Zealand actually have fruits and flowers that are attractive to birds. So they're going to provide very suitable bird habitat. And so you can actually find yourself making a number of gains in different services. So you can actually have really distinct biodiversity gains as well as gains as regards fire mitigation.
Yeah. It seems like a real win-win, and
absolutely,
if you're into your biodiversity as we are. So
that's certainly what we're describing it as. Yeah.
And of course, in natural native forest regeneration, which is one of my passions, we're very much trying not to plant because we want to go through those natural ecological successional processes. Yep. But I think this is one situation where planting is a very good idea. And but there might be some places where we wouldn't want to plant, perhaps where historically trees have not been before, wetlands, peatlands. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a number of different things that you want to take into account when you're restoring a patch of vegetation. And the number one thing, of course, is what's your goal? What are you actually trying to achieve? And that could be based on what the community that grew there prior to degradation was. And that should certainly help guide the sorts of species that you might either plant in there or that might come back. And we don't necessarily need to be restoring forest everywhere across New Zealand, because while prior to humans arriving, about 85% of the country was probably forest, not all of it was. And nor will necessarily, restoring 85% forest be a desirable goal for New Zealand. We can't have forest everywhere, and so it's very much a case of thinking through what was there in the past, so what might grow well there, and but thinking what might do well in the future. So how are changing environmental conditions going to influence what might be possible for your location, and then very much thinking about what your goal is. Are you trying to restore bird life, for instance, in which case you might plant a certain suite of species? Are you trying to restore a wetland, in which case you'd plant probably a different or some different species? And so you should very much think about things in those terms. What's your goal and what might be best suited to the site.
Yes. Now, we'll move on now to your barbecue.
Sure.
It's not like it's that sunny a day today, but however, I know that you've used your barbecue to be looking at the flammability of different types of primarily native species, was it? Of tree?
No, both natives and exotics. So we've been doing this since 2012 now, so for quite a few years. I'm originally from Australia. I had dabbled in a little bit of plant flammability work over there, but as I was coming across the ditch to take up my job here at Lincoln, there was a scientific paper published from Argentina which described essentially a plant barbecue for measuring flammability. So that's a 45-gallon drum cut in half lengthways, then laid on its side. It's essentially how Argentinians build their own homemade barbecues to grill the magnificent steaks that they so love in that country. But in this case, you're laying a plant sample on top of it and igniting it with a blowtorch. And then you can make a number of different measurements, like the maximum temperature reached by the sample, how long it burns for, how quickly it ignites, and how much of the sample has burnt. And based on those pieces of information, we can then compare the flammability of a wide range of different species. I say we've now tested over 550 species throughout New Zealand, including a wide range of different species. So a number of our native species, but also exotic plants grown in gardens, exotic weeds, also crops and pastures as well too. So we've just been working on a project called Fighting Fire with Food, where we can actually start to understand which plants, including crops, pastures, mahinga kai, so traditional Maori foods, and rongoa, traditional Maori medicines, might actually have low flammability and therefore could be used as part of green firebreaks.
That's really interesting. So I was just wondering if you have been looking at the wet and dry branches. So if a forest is live, most of those branches have got a relatively high moisture content, but then there may be other branches that are on the ground decomposing. And how did you measure those?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Maureen. And with the moisture content, that's probably the most crucial point. We've determined, as have others around the world, that the moisture content of a plant is probably the most important thing that's going to determine how flammable it is. And obviously, if it's dead material, it's going to have, unless it's been raining, it's generally going to have a very low moisture content. We've been testing live fuels, so essentially the fuels that you collect off a living tree. Having said that, a number of those plants, including things like gorse, retain a lot of dead material. And of course, that actually leads to them being more flammable than certain other species. So what we do is we collect a sample up to 70 centimetres in length, and then our protocol is to air dry that just for 24 hours, which is really just to get rid of any moisture that might be on the surface of the plant, but also to sort of provide a broader contrast between species that have got really high moisture content and are going to be low in flammability, and species that are got very low moisture contents and then high in flammability. Did I just give the two ends of the spectrum then?
I think you did.
Excellent.
So if we were to then compare a highly flammable species with a low flammable species, what are the key differences?
Yeah, so as I said, moisture content's one of the main ones. So a lot of our highly flammable species generally have low levels of moisture, usually associated but not always with having small leaves, just sort of less capacity to store high levels of moisture. The highly flammable species will also, like as I mentioned with gorse, often retain a lot of dead material. A key native group that does that is our tussock grasses, so our snow tussocks, for instance. The kind of clovers are very flammable, and a large part of that is all the dead material that they retain on their plant. Some of these plant species will also have essential oils that are highly flammable. So you gave the example at the start of kanuka and manuka. And of course, they're both in the Myrtaceae family, the eucalypt family. And like eucalypts, they have a lot of, really wonderful smelling essential oils that we use for a variety of different purposes. They're probably originally derived by the plant to help reduce herbivory by various animals, but have been shown in a number of studies around the world, including our work here, that they can actually also contribute to increased flammability. And so those are sort of a range of the different characteristics. We've had work done in the past that has also shown that architecture can play a role. So if you think of a tree or shrub that got a lot of fine branches, more finely textured, as opposed to one where it's got fewer branches and the fuel is much more spaced out, that will also contribute. But overwhelmingly, the most important thing is moisture content.
Interesting. And then if we think of the forest in totality, we often tend to focus on trees, I notice. Mm-hmm. But of course, there's a lot of other vegetation layers there too.
Absolutely.
And they will be contributing to the overall moisture levels in that forest, won't they too?
Yep, that's very much the case. And that's the other thing too with regenerating or restoring forest in New Zealand. If you're restoring to a rainforest, you're generally restoring to a closed canopy forest, which is generally going to have a higher moisture content, a cooler microclimate as well too, all of which also contribute to suppressing fire. So it's not just that many, not all, of our rainforest trees actually have lower inherent flammability. When they're actually growing in a rainforest situation, closed canopy, there's going to be moist layers, there's going to be higher moisture, there's going to be more rapid turnover of leaf litter. So that's not going to hang around as long and become a fuel for fires. There's also going to be a range of different species in the understory, many of which are possibly going to be lower in flammability as well too.
And so to have this healthy green firebreak, we want to be encouraging a very healthy ecosystem there. And so not allowing the livestock and the deer and the sheep.
Absolutely, particularly with the deer or any sort of, I guess, browsing animals. And there's a really good reason for that is there's a lot of work some work being done overseas, including in woody communities, that have shown that palatability and flammability negatively correlated. So in other words, things that are more highly palatable are low in flammability, and things that are low in palatability are higher in flammability. And if you think of our forest in New Zealand, a lot of our more palatable species are those, fleshy leaved, high moisture content, high nutrient content species, and they tend to be the less flammable species as well too. I've got a PhD student from India, Aben, who's just about to start his work and is actually going to be testing that as one of his chapters. But I suspect what would happen is if you allow deer, for instance, to browse through a forest, they would preferentially take out a lot of the less flammable species. And so they would be increasing the inherent flammability of that forest as a consequence. Grasses are grasses aren't different because grasses follow the same pattern as well too, but you obviously want to ensure that you don't have, dry rank grasses as best you can. So some grazing might be quite useful, particularly in the early stages where you're trying to sort of suppress grasses and keep particularly grassy fuel loads down. But then you want to try and very quickly get a closed canopy, which is actually going to shade out most grasses as well too. So again, there's another one of those wins. You get a closed canopy early successional rainforest, and you're actually dealing with a bunch of your weed problems as well too.
Great. Good. Okay. And I know that people will be listening and they'll be saying, but what are these low flammable species? So I was just wondering if you could give us some examples.
Yeah, sure. Well, even better than that, they can actually go and search them out for themselves on Fire and Emergency New Zealand's wonderful website. We've just been working with them, and in December, they published an update to their flammability list, which includes 470 of the species, 476, I think, of the species that we've tested. So if they go to checkitsallright.nz, reduce your risk / low flammability plants, they can actually find that list and go and search through it themselves. But some of the species, just looking here, kawa, which is one of our most important rongoa species, very low in flammability. We couldn't get it to ignite on our barbecue. Lancewood, pate or seven finger, marble leaf, various different coprosmas, Griselinia or broadleaf is another really good green firebrate, which encouragingly is used widely as a hedge species in urban areas. Tree fuchsia, kaikomako is another low flammability species. Five finger, also low, and kofi as well too. So there's a wide range of species, native species, that people could choose from. Basically choose the palette that best suits where they're from in the country and which what sort of a habitat that they're trying to restore, and they could go in and find suitable low flammability species.
It's great, and it's so great that you've got help to get that resource online for people. So I'll definitely be sharing that at the end of this as well. And it sounds like you've really hit a momentum here. Have you had challenges getting people to come on board?
Not really. It's been, pardon the pun, a bit of a slow burn. It sort of, I think things picked up quite a bit after the Port Hills fires, and people started to realise just how important this was for New Zealand. And of course, since the Port Hills fires, we've had a number of really quite destructive wildfires around the place in New Zealand, so things like Lake Ohau and elsewhere. And so people are actually quite keen on getting this sort of information and working out what they can do for themselves in their own part of the world. Councils have actually been really proactive with this as well too. Christchurch City Council, for instance, put in a green firebreak up on the Summit Road on the Port Hills following the 2017 Port Hills fires, back when they were doing a big tree planting effort for some of the areas that had burnt. So there's essentially a showcase L-shaped version of a green firebreak up on the Worsleys Road and Summit Road intersection up on the Port Hills that people could go and have a look at, which is now must be about 7 years old, and so actually starting to get quite dense and probably getting very close to being able to function as a green firebreak.
That's a good question. How long does it take?
So the green firebreak that stopped that really intense wildfire in the testing in China was 20 years old. So obviously the older the better, because the more mature and the larger the trees and the vegetation in that green firebreak is likely to be. But it will depend a lot on the nature of what you're planting in there. So and the location. So if you're in a reasonably wet, well-resourced, high nutrients sort of part of the world, then, some of these things could grow quite quickly and, maybe in 10 years or more could start to be, closing up and starting to function and provide some benefit. I suspect as time goes on that benefit will increase. And I guess that's a key point with green firebreaks is they're a sort of a decadal scale management tool. So you really want to start getting them in as early as you can to sort of start getting that benefit in, 10, 20 years down the track. That's not to say you only have to plant green firebreaks. You could plant individual low flammability species around your house and various other locations as well too, to help minimise fire impacts.
Yes, and another great thing about trees, I've noticed since my hedge has become a larger and wilder green firebreak, that it's actually really helped with wind as well.
Yes.
My house used to get buffeted around, and it's not getting buffeted anymore.
Again, one of those ecosystem services, another one of those wins. So you can have win-win-win-win-win. With biodiversity conservation, a shelter belt, fire mitigation, even food provision, cultural reconnection, depending on the nature of the species that you've got growing there. So it's really quite exciting actually.
Cool. And so do you feel very optimistic going to the future that we are heading into a less friendly climate? This is really an important tool. Like, how excited do you feel about this?
Yeah, really excited. And I think, again, it's just one of the tools to help mitigate fires, but it's a tool that is multifunctional. So it's what we call a nature-based solution to climate change and the consequences of that. So what that means is planting green firebreaks will help us solve multiple of the crises that we're facing.
Thanks so much to Dr. Tim Curran for coming on this episode. I'm really taken with the value of native green firebreaks as an important tool to minimise the risk of fire. Green firebreaks bring wins for biodiversity. They provide a native seed source for our naturally regenerating forest and help protect our homes from fire and wind. And something we didn't mention is that New Zealand is unusual in that 98% of our fires are caused by humans, according to National Wildfire Manager Tim Mitchell from Fire and Emergency New Zealand. So it's up to us to be as careful as we can and avoid tools or anything that could spark on hot, dry days. Thank you for listening to Rewilding in Action. I'm Maureen Howard, and I'd be so grateful if you could share this podcast with anyone you know who has regenerating forest on their property. And until next time, I will leave you with the simulated call of the now extinct giant Haast's eagle, recorded on January 2019, simulation by Piers Gilbertson from Te Papa, and requested by my guest, Dr. Tim Curran, a rewilder who is letting nature take the lead.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.